our okay, thanks. So yeah, so it's as I said, like we merge like two disciplines here, monetary policy and labor economics, and more particularly, we ask three questions. First of all, like whether monetary policy is affecting earnings inequality. So earnings, we mean like labor earnings. So it's only labor market channel we study here. And we try to investigate whether monetary policy shocks actually affect people from different earnings groups differently. So whether high-income workers or low-income workers are exposed more to monetary policy shocks, and from this labor market channel or earnings heterogeneity channel. And second, we split these effects into two regimes, so high inflation regime and low inflation regime. And this is motivated by this last surge in prices we had, like starting in 2022. Inflation increased a lot in Europe. And we just want to understand whether this transmission of monetary policy on earnings of workers differs by high inflation regime and low inflation regime. First of all, in which regime is a monetary policy more powerful, and then whether these distributional effects are also different in two regimes. So lastly, when we have disadvantaged regimes as well, we try to understand how much it matters for the consumption. And then as the consumption is something that central banks want to affect. This is how they make their monetary policy effective. So we want to understand this transmission of monetary policy via this earnings heterogeneity channel. And the emphasis on the word heterogeneity. So if like these households who have higher MPC, higher marginal propensity to consume, whether they are also more, if they are also more responsive to monetary policy shock, this amplifies the response of consumption to monetary policy shocks. So we also want to merge these two steps in the analysis. First, like which income groups are more responsive to monetary policy, and then we want to also map whether the same income groups, whether they have higher MPC or lower MPC than on average. If they have a higher MPC than on average, this would amplify the consumption response because the more responsive households are affected the most. If it's vice versa, then it would sort of dampen the reaction in consumption. So in a way, it also like matters a lot for how we understand the response of consumption after the monetary policy shock. And our contribution, like to the research, is like first of all this high and low inflation regimes. Our like advantage comes a lot from data. So we received this earnings data quite quickly. So with a very short lag. So when the high inflation period started in 2022, we already had access to data. So we were like able to have these effects for this high inflation regime already available now. Usually like this data becomes available with a time lag. And the last like high inflation episode was, I don't know, more than 40 years ago. So it's, you have to really go back a lot in data to have such a high inflation compared to the one in 2022. And second, our contribution comes from this aggregate amplification. So it's it hasn't been actually estimated before how these earnings heterogeneity channel and this also heterogeneity in MPCs amplifies transmission of monetary policy. There have been some sort of indirect estimates, so using theoretical models. We contribute here because we have really high frequency identification of this exposure by income groups to the monetary policy shock, and we can link these income groups to the MPC of households using the household finance and consumption survey data. So we have like various databases we combine here, but like one of the advantages is that we can link these income responses to the response in consumption. So we can merge these two databases. And last but not least, is that our earnings data is also available at very high frequency. So it becomes available quite quickly, but also like unlike in other countries where usually you have income data available at the yearly frequency, what concerns administrative data, we have this administrative data on income available at a monthly frequency. And monthly frequency is usually the frequency of monetary policy shocks as well. So it's really important in order to identify the effect of monetary policy on earnings inequality to have the monetary policy shock and the earnings data available within the same frequency. So most papers use yearly data here. So in terms of data, we also have this advantage, and we also like compare our results to the yearly data results, and we actually shows that it makes a difference. What is the frequency of this earnings data you have at your disposal? Yes, sure.
You have access to financial asset valuable data. Because consumption is, how to say, it's very noisy in the sense of to contrast with the household overall income and what happens to their savings.
Yes, this is a good point. We do not study this cash flow channel here. So what is a sort of liquid asset position of households? We just study this, how much the household earnings are affected. And given like this household position in terms of income level, we match this with the household self-estimated MPC. So, and this, in a way, we could think that this already incorporates what is the net liquid asset position. So the households just like self-report if they get a windfall gain of, I don't know, of their monthly earnings size, how much would they consume within a year? So we would expect that like such a response would take into account like what is a liquid asset position within the household. So indirectly we can control for this, directly not. So this is a response. Thanks. So briefly about the literature as well. So distributional impact of monetary policy has been studied a lot and mostly using Scandinavian admin data. Not all the studies focus on earnings heterogeneity channel. Some studies can do more. They have also the distribution of liquid assets available or some proxies of consumption available for population. We talk more to this literature where they study specifically earnings heterogeneity channel. So these are the papers by Amber, Troyer, and Huber and Seminar. Recent influential papers, and what we can do better than they do is in terms of earnings heterogeneity channel is we just have this better data. So this is like how we contribute to these findings, just like covering one more country and then using having a better data at our disposal. Another thing where we contribute is that whether monetary policy can have a state-dependent impact. So it has been shown that monetary policy is more powerful in recessions, and also like during this last inflation episode, it has been shown that using like aggregate data set in US, like monetary policy was more powerful during this high inflation episode in this last years after 2022. So we contribute there by splitting these periods to low and high inflation regimes, but we have distributional effects. So in addition to these aggregate estimates we have distributional effects. And lastly, this consumption link, as I said, like so far the papers, they have some sort of theoretical simulation or when there are empirical papers, then they cannot like match directly this response in earnings and response in consumption. So we can actually do a much better job, and we can really see whether this earnings heterogeneity channel amplifies response in consumption or not. And we can empirically actually answer the question how much it matters, how much it amplifies response in consumption. So how strong is this correlation between this exposure to monetary policy shock and heterogeneity and marginal propensity to consume? So it's an empirical paper. So we actually have many spins here and many databases we use. We call this approach from macro to micro and back to macro. So these are the sort of steps we have to go through to get to the results. We start out at the macro level. So we identify monetary policy shock using aggregate time series at the monthly frequency. So using the Krashinsky and Karaudy approach. So this is a surprise-based approach to identify monetary policy shock, and where they also disentangle this central bank's information shock from monetary policy shock. So we focus only on monetary policy shock here. When we have identified this monetary policy shock at the monthly frequency, we take this shock to this microdata. Microdata and earnings. We have a full population of earnings data available at the monthly frequency. So it's the same frequency as our monetary policy shock here. And we just study how much this monetary policy shock matters for change in earnings and whether these effects differ over the income distribution. And when we have estimated these effects, we link this heterogeneous exposure to monetary policy shock to marginal propensity to consume. And for this, we use Estonian Household Finance and Consumption Survey from 2021. So the rest of the database are actually time varying and then quite a long time span. For this MPC estimate, we have only like one year available. So we have to make this assumption that this heterogeneous MPC is sort of time invariant, unfortunately. So the data comes from Estonia. Oh, sorry. Yeah, please.
So if the inflation is very high, then relative wages can change. Relative wages and relative prices can change much more in real term compared to low inflation cases. There are, I guess, many reasons for that. But do you think that what you estimate for Estonia can be compared to other countries or other policy stuff? I don't know, actually. So everybody should do the same thing for their country.
First of all, like this impact on wages, we study in real terms. So during the high inflation regime and low inflation regime, those wages are studied in real terms. So we sort of use the CPI deflated wages. Whether our results are applicable to other countries, I believe so. And I will show later on that actually what concerns all the regimes together when we do not disentangle low and high inflation regimes. Actually, what we find is pretty close that has been found for Sweden or France or Germany. So the results are pretty similar. So I'm not sort of telling you the results yet, but they are pretty similar. What concerns like low and high inflation regimes, so this has not been done before, so distribution effects. So I'm not able to tell whether it's the same in France or Germany because it hasn't been estimated. From US, we know that aggregate effects are similar to us. For US, they find that the monetary policy was more powerful during high inflation regime, and this is also what we find. But the distributional effects in a way are exploratory, so they are not available in the literature so far. Thanks. But of course, we have to keep in mind the background since the data comes from Estonia. Good thing is that the data is very good quality. So monthly frequency earnings data, no top codings, the full population is covered. Good thing is also that Estonia is part of the euro area, so we can use euro area-wide monetary policy shock and feed it into Estonian data, so we are exposed to the same shocks. What we know as a background is that monetary policy has quite strong effect on Estonian economy. So usually the pass-through is quite strong and the impact is quite powerful. And probably the reason behind it is that we have most of the mortgages are adjustable interest rate mortgages. So if the rates are increased, the impact is fed into the economy, into consumers and employers right away. And what concerns institutional background, we also calculate as a background this exposure to business cycle risk, so heterogeneous exposure to business cycle risk. And this is called like GDP betas. And we find that this is very similar that has been found for US. And also if you think in terms of labor market. So our labor market is quite flexible. So in this like institution setting is might be like more closer to US than to Scandinavia, where the previous papers are from mostly. So just for the background. So this is our identified monetary policy shock here. So we use this Jarshinsky and Karadi approach and Pullman sign restrictions as a baseline. You can see that the shocks are sort of quite sort of random over time, even during the slow inflation period. And we can see also that when we split the time period into two regimes, low inflation and high inflation, then we actually have two regimes here, like two periods when we have high inflation regime. Like most of the European countries were exposed to high inflation starting around 2022, but we also had high inflation period in 2008 before the Great Recession. So they were in a way like different regimes. So this was mostly demand driven, this was mostly supply driven. But we have these two episodes of high inflation in our data. And how do we define the split? Is that it's a mean plus standard deviation in inflation. And in our data, so this high inflation regime is at quite high inflation, so 7% or higher. So as a robustness test, we also lower this bar. So we have more periods in high inflation regime, but these confirm our findings. So yeah, sure.
Are these structure
Yes. It's sort of how Jarshinsky and Karadi do it is that they have this surprise in interest rates. So a change in interest rates before the announcement of interest rate change and after the press conference, how much the rates in the market change. So what is a surprise? So what wasn't expected by markets? And then they have a structural model over this change. So if the change brought along increase in rates, brought along increase in financial markets, then they take this as an information shock. So this is not monetary policy shock. But if it has a right direction, if you increase the rates, so the rates increased and stock markets declined, then they take it as a monetary policy shock. So this is basically like intuition behind this identification or the structural model. So now when we have this monetary policy shock identified, we take this into this earnings data. And so the data comes directly from Tax and Customs Board. It's available at monthly frequency. Good thing is that top coding is, for example, what is done with a similar German data is that they do not show you the top 1% of income earners data. So it becomes just too sensitive and this is hidden in the database. We do not have it. So we have all the income earners in our database. So this is what we mean by no top coding. And I will show you later on that actually it matters that really top 0.1% actually is exposed differently than the rest of the distribution. So it really seems to matter that you have this top 1% in your data. And we have this total labor income. So it's a self-employment income plus a wage income, and we deflate it with the CPI, so it's in real terms. And we keep workers at their primary working age from 26 to 65. So, so this is pretty much standard in the literature. What we do is we split all our workers in the database into 12 income groups. First of all, we take the first 9 deciles, and the 10th decile we split into 3. So as I said, we have quite rich data, so we can actually split it into quite small groups. In this 9th decile, we have first from 90 till 99th decile, then from 99 till 99.9 decile, and then we have a very, very top. So we have 0.1% of wage earners. So, and we can really do that because each month we have close to 500,000 observations. And so this 0.1% of wage earners are like close to 500 workers, and then we can really study effect separately for these workers. And in total, we have close to 90 million observations. So it's actually quite a large database we are working here. Yeah, please.
Can you link household numbers in this data? So we will have a check on the household.
In principle, we could. We are not using it currently, but we use it only when we match these responses to MPC, because MPC is a household level variable. But here, when we study exposure to monetary policy shock by earnings, then we actually do not take into account like who is forming a household with whom. So, but in principle, we could here also as well. So the specification is this sort of like non-overlapping dynamic structure called by Kuvanen, and this means that actually we form these income groups from past data, so that it's not overlapping with this income growth variable we have at the left-hand side. So this identified monetary policy shock here at time t is affecting income growth or earnings growth from t to t plus h. So the default age in our data is 12 months. So the monetary policy shock now over the yearly growth in earnings, and then the earnings groups are defined 12 months before the T. So sort of these periods where earnings groups are defined and where we have this earnings growth, they do not overlap. And the dependent variable is midpoint average growth rate. So by labor economists, it's also known as Haltiwanger and Davis growth rate. So the good thing with this is that instead of days past the earnings, we have average earnings from the sort of future and current period divided by 2. And this allows to incorporate entry and exit and sort of this zero earnings to the growth rate here. So when this growth rate is -2, this means that the worker exited from employment within this 12 months. When this growth rate is available is equal to +2, then this means that this worker entered to the labor market. So this earnings at YT were equal to 0. So this is a good thing because we can disentangle. So where from is effect coming? Is it coming from entry and exit, or is it coming from earnings growth? And we can really sort of make them to add up, and it's easy to interpret the effects. These are also important like angles in the specification. We also control for GDP growth, and for GDP growth in the past, before the monetary policy shock, to avoid this case that the monetary policy shock is also affecting GDP. So, and we estimate the same specification for our 12 income groups separately. And so this earnings heterogeneity channel is identified if this P to G is different for different income groups. Yes, please.
In specification, I'm just wondering whether there is no possibility for testing the heterogeneity depending on the level. So because you are just looking for the difference, but then the difference might be differing depending on the level.
These income groups we define by level, of course. These income groups, like where do you belong? This we define by level.
Income, there is no heterogeneity.
Yes, yes. So in effect, yeah. So this is like we estimated separately for the first decile. We define whether workers are belonging to the first decile of income by the income level using the data 12 months before this T.
Yeah, but you have individuals, right?
Yes,
but
and
they
then
are not specific to the income.
You mean that we have heterogeneity within this first decile?
Yeah.
In a way, like we assume that you have the same effect within the first decile. So this we could, in principle, go into more detail instead of deciles have like percentiles, but we haven't done it. And you can see from the results that actually it doesn't matter for this for most of the distribution.
So you only assume that the reaction to the monetary policy shock, that what is specific to the income group, but in the data generating process, you do not assume any heterogeneity in this sense. So that the income difference income increase might be might be heterogeneous across all these groups.
This we actually do estimate, like by deciles, we estimate different impacts. So for example,
I see.
yeah, but within this, yes. Within these deciles, we do not go any further. So we assume that everybody are affected the same way. So, yes, please.
I'm not sure I understand the extensive margin. So you're coding -1 and -2 and +2 the entry and the entry. But you're using the intensive margin is clear. When you're estimating the extensive margin, you're using everybody within the full population, or only the exiters entry.
When we estimate this total effect,
The total effect is including everybody.
So total effect includes these individuals whose wages are available now at T and T plus H.
Yeah.
Plus it includes individuals whose wage was not available either at T or T minus H. But if the wage wasn't available in both of the dates, then we exclude them.
But the extensive margin is only those who are exit,
or yes. If you have in mind like hours the dimension, so working hours, so this extensive margin we cannot touch.
No, I said wasn't clear now.
Yeah. So the ones who haven't been in the labor market for a year, they are out. So these are the results. So this is a total effect here. So this is this midpoint average growth rate. We can see that for the first decile, so this 100 basis point increase in rates creates quite large decline in earnings, and we see that this effect is declining when you go to higher income groups, and at the very top, at the 0.1%, you have a like slight increase again in response. So you have confidence bounce around it, but still you can see that there is sort of some small swing down. But in general, you can see that this effect is declining over income groups, meaning that these are the low-income workers who are more exposed to monetary policy shock. So if the rates are increased, then earnings decline. If the rates are declined, the earnings increase. And this also implies that if the rates are increased, then inequality increases, inequality in earnings or wages increases. If rates are declined, then inequality in earnings declines. But when we go into margins, we can see that margins actually tell quite different story. First of all, this intensive margin, if we exclude these first two income deciles, the effect is quite like similar over the rest of the income groups. Here, probably the minimum wages are binding, so that they are not that responsive here. But usually, like the response for these workers who have been employed for both of the periods, like the wages are increased the same way, independent of where their place is in the income distribution. If you go to the entry and exit margin, we see that these are clearly the low income workers who are exposed to the monetary policy shock. Here, we just estimate the linear probability model. So this entry is equal to 1 if a person entered and 0 otherwise. And we can see that if you increase rates, then the entry goes down. For low-income workers, the probability to enter declines for low-income workers. If you do it the same with exits, that 1 shows if the individual exited and 0 otherwise, we see that also low-income workers have a higher probability to exit after the increase in rates, and this effect ties out to the income distribution. And again, like small swing is up at the very top, so 0.1%. I will show you the same figure, like when we have these effects put together here. So here, like the intensive margin is as before, but we have to multiply this with the ratio of workers who are employed in both areas, so the share of intensive margin, and then we can actually add up all these effects here. So, and this is a like total response we observe here, but here we can really like disentangle like where from is it coming. So we can see that if we have this our monthly data here, most of the effect of monetary policy on earnings comes from this entry and exit margin here. So it's for lowest income deciles, it's actually massively coming from this channel, extensive margin. Intensive margin starts to step in after the median. If we would use yearly data, we actually see quite a different picture. Yes, please.
How fast is the pass-through?
Excuse me?
How fast is the pass-through?
How fast? Yeah. I will.
Half a year or 2
Yeah.
years.
I will show it next slide. Yes. So yearly data, this is where most of the literature is. You can see that in a way they also like get this result that extensive margin is more important for low-income workers, but they actually underestimate the part coming from extensive margin. And the reason is that if you have yearly data, you actually miss a lot of transactions within a year. Actually, especially for these low-income workers, a lot is going on like within the year. So enter employment, exit employment. If you sum it up for the yearly earnings data, you actually sort of miss all these transitions. And for the total effect on earnings, actually, in our monthly frequency, we see that 2/3 of the effect comes from extensive margin. But if you use yearly data, actually, it's only 1/3. So in terms of like interpreting the results qualitatively, it's actually matters that you have this high frequency data available. So this is a question about how long it takes for the monetary policy to have effect. Here it's basically the same figure as we had before, but now we have, instead of 12 months pass-through, we have different, we have a shorter period of 6 months, then baseline is 12 months, then we have 18 months and 24 months as well. And you can see that, so this is a 6-month impact here. So you can see that basically half of the effect takes place within 6 months already. And then by the 12th month, most of the effect has already sort of materialized. So it's here. And so this additional month actually do not add much for the total. So this is like our baseline here. And so we are happy to stay with this 12-month horizon. You can also see that by extensive and intensive margin, there are some differences. It seems that extensive margin materializes quicker, and intensive margin, even like 24 months after the shock, you still have some sort of increasing impact. Although, like in terms of the total effect, like this is less important than these two here. So, was this a response to your question? Yeah, good. Now let us go to inflation regime. Yes.
Do that, slides.
Yes.
So you mentioned that we can learn a lot if we use monthly frequencies. Do you think that it would be worth to go even to kind of weekly frequency, or in this case, these kind of entry-exit periods and that's so do you think it's worth to go?
I think in this case, it wouldn't. And the reason is that it also depends where your monetary policy shock is identified. What is the frequency of monetary policy shock? For us, like the governing council for most of the years in our data was meeting once a month. So basically, the monetary policy shock was identified once a month. So it makes sense to use a monthly frequency data. Yeah. If you would have like a design of a central bank where monetary policy committee or sort of governing council would sort of make these decisions like weekly frequency, then of course it would benefit also to have earnings data as a weekly frequency. Here, given that we are at the euro area and mostly the monetary policy shocks sort of they take place monthly frequency, I do not think there is much value added going like to higher frequency in terms of earnings. So I think it's important that these two match or sort of meet each other. So thanks. But in general, of course, it would be cool to to have daily wages as well. I think Germans actually observe this earnings data daily frequency, so they know each day how many hours people are working. So now we can go to this inflation regime. the empirical specification is very similar as before, but we have now this regime variable, which is interacted with monetary policy shock and also the control variable GDP growth. It's just very simple binary variable. Whether inflation was 7% or higher, then this variable takes value 1. If it was lower than 7%, it takes value 0. And so instead of like one reaction, we have 2 reactions here. And you can see that it's quite evident that the effect is stronger when inflation is higher. So it seems that monetary policy is more powerful during high inflation regime. So this has been observed already in aggregate data. We observe it in microdata as well. And if you zoom in, you can also see that actually the shape of this effect is also different. When we have high inflation regime, we have this weak U shape. If we are in the low inflation regime, then we have this linear shape of the reaction. So it just like ties out for the high income groups, but we do not have any sort of upswing at the top. So, and it's more or less the same story by all the margins, that it seems that monetary policy is more powerful in high inflation regime. We ran a number of robustness tests to actually confirm this finding. First of all, we lower this bar for high inflation regime. We go to 5%. So this is what has been done in US data as well. We see that this story remains, that monetary policy is more powerful in high inflation regime. We use nominal wages instead of real wages, and again, gets the same. We use different monetary policy shocks. We had this Pullman sign restriction as a baseline. We use this median reaction of Bayesian VAR model, get more or less the same. Uses less well identified shock, where we have just a change, like a surprise in interest rates. Again, get the similar message. And then we also change the set of controls. We add the geopolitical risk as a control from contemporary period to the monetary policy shock. And sort of this is important for our database because we had a strong supply side shock like since 2022, but our results basically remain unaltered when we control for this geopolitical risk. The same, we use dynamic specification here. So we add lag dependent variable to the right-hand side, and we still get the same result. So even like it doesn't seem that it's a sort of persistence in earnings growth that is behind the stronger reaction, stronger effect of monetary policy on earnings. So if you do not have any further questions here, then I will go to this consumption side. And what we do here is that we use a recent approach by Patterson, who actually decomposes the reaction in aggregate consumption into 2 parts. So first of all, it's just the income-weighted reaction consumption. So how large is the household share in total income, and given its MPC, and the other part comes how much the shock households are exposed to is correlated with their MPC. So what we have so far here, so this is aggregate MPC. What we have here is how much each household is exposed to aggregate shock. So this is monetary policy shock here. So if this aggregate shock sort of affects the economy, how each household earnings are affected. And now we get from individual level to household level. It basically takes a reaction of all the individuals within the household, and we sum up their earnings change to get the total earnings change per household. And we have estimated this part. What we need here is we need this MPC of a household. So this is if the earnings is increased by a monetary policy shock, how much consumption responds to that. And so this we have so far missing, and we get this MPC reaction from household finance and consumption survey data. And as I said, this data has a very nice question on self-reported MPC. So households are questions that if you get like a lottery win of monthly earnings, your monthly earnings or monthly income, how much of it would you spend within a year? So it's a sort of self-reported number varying from 0 to 100. So how much would you consume? So these households who do not have many liquid assets, they would consume everything. So the ones who do not need that much money, they probably would invest everything. And this has been shown to be like quite a good signal for households true MPC. So if we have this estimate here, we can actually get the total MPC reaction after the monetary policy shock. And what we do now is we just disentangle this total reaction into two components. What is the income weighted average MPC of households, and how much this MPC and exposure to monetary policy shock correlate. So what is the covariance term? If they do not correlate at all, so that these these low-income households that are more exposed to monetary policy shock, that they do not have higher MPC, this part is 0, and we do not have any additional amplification from earnings heterogeneity channel. Sorry. And how do we derive that? We have in the data available like information on earnings and MPC and exposure to monetary policy now. So we first derive this income-weighted MPC, so we know how much each household in the database contributes to total earnings. We get this income weights and derive this income-weighted MPC. And in order to get the total MPC, we have additional layer of weights here. And these weights are how much household is exposed to monetary policy shock relative to average exposure to monetary policy shock. So, for example, these low-income households are 2 times more likely to be affected by monetary policy shock than on average. So we take this into account. So what is the relative weight of each household here to the average response in monetary policy shock? And when we have these 2 layers of weights, income weights and how much a household is exposed to monetary policy shock, we actually can derive the total MPC as a result of monetary policy shock. And this amplification part, this correlation part can be derived as a residual. So total MPC minus this income weighted MPC. Yes?
Maybe I missed one here, but isn't the problem that we just consider labor income? So person shouldn't feel, I don't like to consider here or the income.
It's earnings income. So it's earnings, like labor earnings, like household share in total earnings. So it's basically, yeah, it's not correct to say income, like the total labor income.
Yeah, but so the values, maybe I don't understand it, but when you consider the consume, shouldn't you consider like the benefits and other types of...
The trick is that you're right. So usually, yeah, you could consider all the income household gets, but as we have focus on this labor market channel, so we can take assumptions that these benefits are not affected by monetary policy. So they sort of says wages of workers are affected due to the fact that employers are exposed to higher interest rates. So they have to adjust their workers' wages. But with benefits, we do not assume that such an obvious channel exists there. So basically, all these benefits are actually left out of this exercise now. There are papers where they say estimate this effects on total income as well. And for example, this Danish paper here, and actually they get like a completely different result. So because it's like benefits, pensioners, for example, they affect a lot this lower part of this income distribution, and they are not like necessarily, it's not coming from the theory why they are affected by monetary policy. So we are leaving them out. We focus like purely earnings or labor income. Thanks. So, and these are the results of this putting exposure to monetary policy and MPC together. And what we can see is, first of all, that the marginal propensity to consume can vary a lot. We have this low income households, first decile, and their MPC is close to 50%. So if they get extra income, say within a year, consume close to 50%. Then we have this top 1%, and within a year, they only consume close to 20%. If you add here also exposure to monetary policy shock, so this is an average exposure of households. And you can see that these are low-income households who are exposed more than average. So the most exposed households, or the households affected the most by monetary policy, are the first decile, households from the first earnings decile. And these are exactly the same households who have the highest MPC. So we can, and then we go down, we take the second decile, we see that they still have very high MPC, and they are still strongly exposed to monetary policy shock. Take the third decile, and so on, so on. We can see that we have like roughly this linear relationship formed here. So low-income households are more exposed to monetary policy shock by this earnings channel, and they also have higher MPC. While high-income households, they are less exposed to monetary policy, and they also have lower marginal propensity to consume. So we could see already from these pictures that this covariation part is likely positive, and it's likely contributing to this aggregate response in consumption. And this is exactly what we find. So when we take this income earnings groups here, we take MPCs, we see that the MPC is declining by earnings growth, or like higher earnings groups have lower MPC. When we show this income weights, we see that this lowest income groups, the lowest decile, earnings decile, actually, although it's 10% of households, their income only matters 1.3%. So because incomes are so small. If we add here the monetary policy weight, we see that it's their share actually doubles. It's still small, but compared to 1.3%, it's now 2.6. So the these low income groups actually get more weight if you take this exposure to monetary policy shock into account. And when we add it up, we get with this monetary policy weight, we get much higher MPC than with only this income weight. And the difference between these two is this amplification channel. This positive covariation between exposure to monetary policy shock and MPC. And in our total sample, we find this effect to be like 5%, or like 5% of the response in consumption is actually coming from the fact that the most vulnerable households to monetary policy are also the ones who have the highest MPC. And when we split the two regimes, we see that actually in this low inflation regimes, this amplification part is even larger. Due to the fact that you could remember that the reaction, or the shape of the reaction, was linear in this low inflation regime, and in this high inflation regime, we had this like more like a U-shape reaction. However, when we sum it up to the total effect, due to the fact that monetary policy is more powerful in high inflation regime, we actually see that the consumption on average is more affected during high inflation regime, and also inequality is more affected in high inflation regime. So like, two different layers of effect. So first is this amplification part, and the second is like total aggregate effect, or where in which regime is monetary policy more powerful. So yes, sure.
Perhaps I just missed it, but when the households were asked in the survey to evaluate their own MPCs, were they asked to estimate their response to a permanent income shock or to a transitory income shock? Because the MPC can be very different.
I think this question can be rather labeled as a temporary shock, or not, like, because this is like on-off, like windfall gain question. So this is can rather be interpreted as a temporary shock. And I think we can think about the monetary policy shocks the same way. So it should sort of match. So thanks. So the key takeaways. So first of all, we estimated again, like as it has been done in other papers as well, that low-income workers are exposed the most to monetary policy shocks. So when rates are declined, as it is going on now, monetary policy is reducing inequality. If rates are increased, monetary policy is increasing inequality of this labor income or of workers. Other channels can have different effects. So I would emphasize that we focus here on this labor market channel or earnings heterogeneity channel. And we also show that the distributional impact depends on inflation regime. We estimate that monetary policy actually is more powerful in high inflation regime. It seems to be true. So whatever various robustness tests we have tried here, we keep getting the same message. And when we link this response in earnings with households MPC, we actually see that this heterogeneous response to monetary policy shock actually matters for aggregate response in consumption. It amplifies the consumption response because these households who are more exposed to monetary policy shock are the low-income households who at the same time have also a high MPC. And we find this amplification part to sort of explain 5% of the response in consumption in our estimate. So that is it from my side. So thanks a lot for your patience. So all comments and questions are highly welcome. Thanks. Yeah, please.
So very interesting. Thank you very much. I wonder whether this whole thing is labor supplier, labor demand, result of the labor supplier, labor demand check. Because the whole thing is driven by the extensive market. So right, so people
Yes.
are exiting for being fired.
As a channel that affects workers, we assume it takes place via employers. So, so we would interpret the exit to take place due to the lack of demand, and entry to take place due to the increase in demand. So this would be our result. Whether there could be something indirect related to the workers' decision or supply, I would say that given how we identify this monetary policy shock, we cannot tell anything.
What's not really clear for me is that I don't see the connection that, you know, if the national bank increases the base point, how does it go through companies not wanting employers? It must be some sort of a substitution between capitals, and human capital being one of them.
I think it's we haven't done it, but I can refer to colleagues here like Hubert and Savignac that they actually show like from which sectors is this effect coming from, and they show that it's coming actually from sectors where there is a lot of debt financing. So it actually comes from the fact that employers, they have they use debt to finance their investments. If the cost of debts go up, they have a cost shock. So they should somehow adjust to this cost shock. And one way to adjust to this cost shock is to let some of your workers go. And I think one of the reasons why these are mostly these low-income workers, they probably let go these workers who are easiest to replace, so the low-skilled workers. So I think this is a mechanism, seems to be from the literature. Yeah, thanks.
Well, I'm not quite sure whether what we are seeing as a result can be totally attributed to the monetary policy. There are many examples when there are different types of regimes. The fiscal policy cannot be, so to say, claimed to be the same and homogeneous during these two high and low inflation periods. Well, a few examples. If the indexing is not complete, and we know that the indexing cannot be complete, fully complete, so then this is quite obvious that there might be some heterogeneity which is due to this fiscal policy type of measure, and also in case of the US, there was this paying out a huge amount, which changed the reaction of the large mass of people. So if we have this type of regimes, and we are, so to say, imposing the same type of structure without knowing that what is going on in the fiscal policy side, And whether, I don't know whether the Estonia is a typical case for that, but other countries are typically out of the scheme in the sense that the heterogeneity, partly at least, should be contributed to other type of measures than just the monetary policy.
Yeah, you're completely right. And this sort of, in a way, like when rates go up, so it is endogenous. So, and there are many other things going on simultaneously. So one way how to address this problem is that to have these monetary policy shocks. So this is why we have this identified monetary policy shocks. So this is like this Bayesian bar approach. You can see that it's really random. So if you would add here like fiscal shocks, I'm sure it wouldn't correlate with this monetary policy shock. It's just like, it seems to be quite random. And also the same, like if you go to high inflation regime, you go to low inflation regime, here you see like the same randomness. So in a way, like, and we use these identified shocks to feed these into the earnings of individuals. And only like studies this correlation between these identified shocks and earnings growth. Of course, like other things explain also the earnings growth, but we try to identify only this part that is a result of this shock, identified shock. And might be like one more figure to convince you that might be, it is monetary policy shocks that we are identifying here is that this figure here. So this actually takes into account also the persistence in earnings growth. So it's sort of, we have this lag dependent on the right-hand side. So you could also see that, I don't know, if something is systematically driving the growth of wages up, like for a long time, so this could also take it into account, but we more or less still get the same message. Of course, like we cannot purely exclude the fact that there can be other factors. And I don't know if there were a good way to identify the same way, like fiscal shocks, and add them to the model as well, control them both, would be nice, but we haven't done it. And this is usually like, but it's not done. So I don't know whether I was capable of convincing you.
Asking that if you main estimating function should be somehow completed with other type of variables, which might be closer to the fiscal stance.
Yeah, to add, yeah.
So that's my point.
Yeah.
It requires for the process.
Yeah.
And the interpretation of the results.
Yes.
I do not require to be able to so to say explore the full content of the fiscal monetary nexus, but what you are looking at might be affected very significantly by these other factors, mainly coming from the fiscal side.
Yeah, you're right. So one sort of, these are controls we haven't incorporated so far. So we have tested this geopolitical risk. We have also control for lagged unemployment dynamics, GDPs by defaulting, but this fiscal stance we haven't controlled, but you're right, we could actually do it, add it. Thanks.
My question is the monetary policy action is usually a response to like soaring inflation or currency crisis. How can you be sure that what you have measured is not the effect of one of those?
What do you mean by other measures, or so can you bring
No,
example?
for example, how can you be sure that what you have measured is not the effect of the soaring inflation?
So you mean that the regime itself is affecting how markets react, or?
No, just the inflation itself. Maybe I misunderstood something. But the monetary policy action is a response to something else, and usually I wonder how can you be sure that what you measure is not the origin but effect the wages is this, for example, soaring inflation.
Like one way to sort of exclude this fact is that you're right that our default variable is real wages. So real wages are deflated by CPI, which of course is affected by inflation. But as a robustness test, we also run this the same specification with nominal wages, and it's pretty similar. But this is like our way to sort of convince the reader that might be it's not direct effect coming from inflation. So it's actually pretty similar to our baseline. We get like stronger reaction in low inflation regime, but in general it's similar.
Thank you very much for the presentation. If anyone has any more questions, then it will be still here on the protocol, so you can just rather discuss. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.